On this cafe, we're going to talk about one of the great inventors of the 19th century, Alexander Graham Bell. We're also going to talk about a famous song from the 20th century, At Last. And as always, we'll answer a few of your questions. Why not? Let's get started. Alexander Graham Bell was born in March of 1847 in the city of Edinburgh, Scotland. Scotland, of course, is part of the United Kingdom. Bell's mother was nearly deaf. His father taught elocution to deaf people. Deaf, D-E-A-F, means you are unable to hear for some medical reason. Sometimes we use the term nowadays hearing impaired to describe people who either have difficulty hearing or can't hear at all. Elocution, E-L-O-C-U-T-I-O-N, describes the skill of speaking clearly, of pronouncing your words clearly. Bell's mother was almost deaf, and his father, as I mentioned, taught elocution to deaf people. So Bell had a lot of experience working with the deaf as he grew up. And not surprisingly, it's a topic that interested him as an adult. One thing that did not interest Bell very much, however, was going to high school. In fact, he left high school at the age of 15 without graduating. His family later moved to London, England, in 1865, and in 1868, Bell became a student at University College, London. Once again, however, he did not graduate. The main reason was that his family had decided to move to Canada in 1870 after two of Bell's brothers died of tuberculosis, a disease that affects the lungs. Shortly after moving to Canada, Bell left and moved to Boston, Massachusetts. There he began teaching at a local school for the deaf. In fact, he taught at a couple of different schools in the northeast part of the United States, eventually moving to a school in Hartford, Connecticut, which is not too far from New York City. It was there, at the American School for the Deaf, that Bell met a young student, the daughter of the person who started the school, a woman by the name of Gardner Green Hubbard. Even though Bell was 10 years older than Gardner, he fell in love, and the two of them married, eventually having 4 children, although only 2 of those survived into adulthood. That is, 2 of the children that the Bell family had died very young. While Bell was teaching, he got interested in researching new technology. That is, new ways of doing things with machines and equipment by applying his scientific knowledge to the world of technology. Scotland has a long history of famous inventors, and Alexander Graham Bell continued in that tradition, getting interested in invention. In the late 19th century, there were many prominent inventors who not only worked in one area of science and technology, but often took their interest in science and applied it to a number of different areas. Thomas Edison is a famous example of that. Alexander Graham Bell is another. The technology that Alexander Graham Bell got interested initially, at first, was telegraph technology. The telegraph, T-E-L-E-G-R-A-P-H, was one of the primary modes of communication during the 19th century, especially the late 19th century. Basically, a telegraph, if you don't know, is a way of sending communication, sending messages across a wire, a long piece of thin metal. The telegraph technology allowed people to send messages using electrical signals going across or traveling across the wires. This allowed people to communicate quickly over long distances, something that had not been possible before this time. As the telegraph became more popular in the middle of the 19th century, people began to look for ways of improving the technology, of making it possible not only to send messages going in one direction, but in both directions, and even more, the ability to send multiple messages at the same time across the telegraph wires. One of the first people to invent a way of doing this was another famous American inventor, Thomas Edison. Edison found a way of sending up to 4 messages simultaneously, that is, at the same time, across a telegraph wire. But some people, including Alexander Graham Bell, said, well, why should we stop at 4? Maybe we should try to have even more messages sent back and forth. Several inventors, including Alexander Graham Bell and another man by the name of Elisha, E-L-I-S-H-A, Gray, G-R-A-Y, tried to beat Edison's accomplishment of 4 signals. They tried to get as many as 10 signals. Now, Alexander Graham Bell's father-in-law, whose last name was Hubbard, decided to give Bell some money so he could work on these new inventions, especially with telegraph machines. However, Bell, as happens often to inventors, got bored of the idea of just inventing ways of sending more messages across the telegraph wire. He got interested in the idea of sending voice messages across the wires. Both he and his rival, or his competing inventor, Elisha Gray, tried to invent a way of sending voice messages across the wire. Finally, in early February of 1876, Bell felt that he had a good idea, so he went to the U.S. government and tried to get a patent for his idea. A patent, P-A-T-E-N-T, is basically a government license, an official government document that says you invented this technology, and therefore you own this technology. No one else can use it without your permission. Bell went to the U.S. government patent office and gave his patent idea to the office on February 14th, 1876. Just a couple of hours later, on that same day, Elisha Gray came with his patent idea. But he was too late. Bell had arrived at the office a few hours before Elisha Gray, and therefore the government gave Alexander Graham Bell the patent. Some people call this the most valuable patent in the history of modern technology. And if you walk down the street of any city or town in the world nowadays, you can see people talking on telephones thanks to the patent and ideas of Alexander Graham Bell. It took a few more weeks for Bell to actually make a telephone that would communicate a message. The first telephone signal was sent on March 10th, 1876. It was the first phone call. Bell had called his assistant, Thomas Watson, from another room in the same house. His message was quite simple. "Mr. Watson, come here. I want to see you." Over the next few months, Bell developed his technology, and eventually he and his father-in-law started a company that would use this technology. I mentioned earlier that inventors sometimes get bored with their new invention and decide to go and work on something else. This is exactly what happened to Alexander Graham Bell. Even though he had made a lot of money from his invention with the help of his father-in-law's investment, he decided to sell his part of the company and work on something else different. In fact, by the mid-1880s, Bell wasn't really involved in the telephone industry at all, even though his name continues to be associated with the telephone. He didn't make as much money as he could have had he stayed involved in the telephone business. But as I said, Bell got bored and decided to do something different. He wanted to work instead on an invention that Thomas Edison had created, the phonograph. The phonograph was one of the earliest machines that could record and play sound back, such as music or speech. Edison had invented the phonograph about the same time that the telephone was being invented in 1877, but it wasn't a very good design. Alexander Graham Bell thought he could make it better. I use the word design, D-E-S-I-G-N, in that last sentence. A design is a plan of how something works or what something looks like. The problem with Edison's phonograph is that it wasn't the best design possible for recording and producing speech. So Bell started working on this invention, and eventually, in the mid-1880s, he, his cousin, and another inventor came up with an improvement on the phonograph. They called it the graphophone. And they, of course, went to the U.S. government and got a patent for their invention. The group started a new company called the Volta Graphophone Company. They, however, sold their patents to another company the very next year in 1887. That company later became the Columbia Phonograph Company, which in later years changed its name to the Columbia Record Company. Nowadays, it's called Columbia Music and is still around here in Los Angeles, though it's owned by Sony Entertainment in Japan. Bell took the money he made from this graphophone invention and invested it in new research projects in a company he called the Volta Laboratory. Bell had actually already been working on other inventions even when he was working on the graphophone. For example, he invented a way for doctors to be able to find bullets that had been shot into the body. The reason he invented this machine was that the President of the United States, James Garfield, had been shot in July of 1881, but the doctors couldn't find the bullet in his body. Bell tried to use his new invention to find that bullet. He failed, and Garfield died, but his invention was later used by doctors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries to help save soldiers who were shot during wars, including the Boer War and World War I. Bell had an inventive mind. In addition to working on electrical and electromagnetic inventions, he also got interested in flight, in flying. He decided to try to improve some of the inventions that the Wright brothers had come up with, although he wasn't ultimately very successful. Bell used his money not just for himself, but also to encourage others to do scientific research. One of the ways he did that was to help start something called the National Geographic Society, which is still around today. He was president of that society from 1898 to 1903. He also gave money to a scientific journal, which we now know as Science, one of the best scientific journals in the world. Bell died in Canada at a house he had built for himself in 1903. He was not only an extraordinary inventor, but a man who loved science and technology that helped change the world in ways that we can still see and hear today. We turn now briefly to one of the more famous songs from the middle part of the 20th century that has become even more famous in recent years. That song is At Last. At last means the same as finally. If you are waiting for someone to meet you at a restaurant and the person is 30 minutes late, when they finally arrive, you may say, "At last, you're here." The song At Last was written in 1941 by two composers, two writers of songs, Mac Gordon and Harry Warren. It was written to be part of a film, of a movie called Sun Valley Serenade. A serenade, S-E-R-E-N-A-D-E, is a piece of music usually sung or played outdoors, sung by a man to a woman. Well, not just any woman, but to a woman he loves, of course. The movie told the story of an orchestra leader, a person who was the leader of a group of musicians, who falls in love with a woman while playing a show, while being part of a performance in Sun Valley. Sun Valley is located in the state of Idaho and is somewhat famous for being a place to go skiing, to go downhill skiing on the mountains in that area. Idaho is located in the western part of the United States, on the border of Canada, between the states of Montana and Oregon and Washington. At Last was recorded by the Glenn Miller Orchestra, one of the most famous bands or musical groups of the 1930s and early 1940s. It was recorded in 1942 and became a very popular song on the radio. It was also used for another movie that same year, strangely. The most well-known version of the song, however, was recorded several years later in 1961 by the singer Etta James. Etta James was a rhythm and blues singer who usually didn't sing songs like this, songs that we would describe as being ballads. A ballad, B-A-L-L-A-D, is a slow, emotional song that is often romantic or about love. Etta James was an African-American singer who was famous for singing the kinds of songs called rhythm and blues that were popular in the African American community and eventually became the inspiration for rock music. In any case, the song tells the story of two people, a man and a woman, who have found love together. The most famous part of the song comes at the beginning, where the singer sings the first two words in a very dramatic fashion, where the word last continues for a very long time. At last, my love has come along. My lonely days are over, and life is like a song. Well, Etta James does it a lot better. You can Google her. Go to YouTube, put in Etta, E-T-T-A, James, J-A-M-E-S, at last, and you'll hear a much better version. The song, of course, begins by talking about how my love has come along. To come along here means to come to you or to arrive where you are. The singer says, my lonely days are over. I will no longer be by myself. I will no longer be sad because I am alone. James' version of the song became very popular and was in fact the second most popular R&B or rhythm and blues song that year. It also became a very popular song to sing at weddings. The song was recorded later by many well-known singers, including Celine Dion, Gladys Knight, and others. Perhaps the most famous recent performance of the song, the reason why the song has become popular in recent years, was one done by Beyoncé, the singer, the American singer. Beyoncé sang the song for the first dance between President Obama and his wife Michelle after President Obama became president in January of 2009. That performance was broadcast and millions of Americans saw it. This African American president dancing with his wife to a song that had become famous by an African American. Of course, the meaning of the words "at last" for that performance was not about romance. It wasn't about love. It was about the fact that finally, at last, there was an African American president. So it took on a different meaning, a very powerful meaning to be sure. Now let's, at last, answer your questions. Our first question comes from Kae, C-A-E, in Japan. The question has to do with the noun fish. The question is, what is the plural form of fish? F-I-S-H. In 99.9% of the cases, the plural of fish is fish. There's no es at the end of the word. We don't say fishes. We instead say pieces of fish. The plural of fish, then, is almost always spelled the same as the singular form, which is fish. Why is this so? The reason is that fish is what we call a uncountable or non-count noun. A non-count noun is a noun that you don't count the same way as you count most things. For example, I have a pen. I have 10 pens. Notice the S at the end. I have 5 computers. Once again, the S sound at the end. For most nouns in English, the plural is formed, that is, the plural is spoken and written, with the S at the end, or the S sound. Some nouns, the S sound is written as an ES. Most nouns in English are count nouns. You count them and you make it plural by adding an S sound at the end. However, there are some nouns that are called non-count nouns, and fish is an example of a non-count noun. Another example of a non-count noun is milk. Traditionally, liquid has been considered non-count in the cases of milk, tea, and coffee. However, those have changed a little bit in recent years. People talk about getting 2 coffees, even when they really mean 2 cups of coffee. So English has changed over the years, but there are still nouns that are definitely non-count nouns in all cases. For example, fun and happiness. We don't talk about funds or happinesses. We talk about fun as a noun, as a non-count entity, something that is not made plural by adding an S sound at the end. I said that 99.9% of the time, the plural of fish will be fish. However, in scientific use, sometimes we talk about different kinds of fish, different species of fish, in a way that reflects a count noun. So we'll say fishes, but this is very, very rare. And as I say, for most cases, you can simply use fish for both singular and plural. If you want to express a plural idea with fish, you'll have to add another phrase, such as pieces of fish or types of fish. If you go to a restaurant, you may get 2 pieces of fish, or you and your girlfriend might both get pieces of fish. The plural is expressed by pieces, which has, of course, an S sound at the end, because piece is a count noun and fish is a non-count noun. Our next question comes from Ali, A-L-I, in Iran, who apparently has been listening to American radio, especially National Public Radio, which is a national radio system in the U.S. I say public, that doesn't mean it is the government's system. It's actually a private collection of radio stations that receives very little money from the U.S. government. The U.S. government does have its own radio service that's called Voice of America. NPR, or National Public Radio, is radio that is supported by private companies and organizations and individuals. In any case, one of the most famous radio programs on NPR is called All Things Considered. What does that phrase, all things considered, mean? Ali asks. All things considered means after carefully thinking about all the facts and the opinions that are out there. It's used in conversational English, actually, at the beginning of an expression or at the beginning of a sentence to mean I have thought about everything or taking everything into consideration if we think about all the different factors and variables. All things considered, I think today has been a good podcast. This episode has been pretty good, all things considered. There, all things considered means when we think about all the different parts. Oh, sure, there have been good things and there have been bad things, but all things considered, I think it's been pretty good. Often when we use this phrase, all things considered, there are both good and bad elements in the situation that we're talking about. So we're trying to give our opinion considering or thinking about all those different elements. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing. You could say, all things considered, I think the election of 2016 for president is the worst election we've ever had in our history. I look at good things, I look at bad things, but all things considered, it's pretty terrible. That would be an example of using that phrase in conversational English. It's used by NPR as the name of a radio program that's on every day that gives you the news for that day as well as other special reports. Finally, JD, J-A-D-Y, in South Korea, wants to know the meaning of the phrase to talk tech, T-E-C-H. Tech is short for technology and often refers to either computers or internet-related topics. To talk something means to talk about it or to have a discussion about it. If you say to someone, let's talk tech, you mean let's talk about technology. Maybe you want to talk about your new computer, or maybe you have questions for the other person about some internet website or social media service. You could also say, I want to talk business. I want to talk California. Whatever the topic is that you want to talk about could be followed by that verb talk, especially in the expression let's talk or I'm going to talk. You could also say talk about. That grammatically would be more correct. It would be more correct grammatically, or at least more acceptable according to formal grammar rules, to use a preposition after talk. Let's talk about tech. Let's talk about love. There was a song not too long ago, let's talk about sex, but we're not going to talk about that here. However, in more informal English, people sometimes don't use the word about and just put the subject of what would be the prepositional phrase beginning with the preposition about right after the verb talk. So let's talk tech means let's talk about technology. There's no difference between using the about and not using the about. It's just become a little bit more common recently to not use the preposition about, at least among some English speakers. If you have a question or comment, you can email us.